Okay, in this video, we're going to still talk about dividing square roots, but we'll talk about what if A is not divisible by B. We'd never want to have a final answer where we have a square root in the denominator. And we never want to have a final answer where we have the square root of a fraction either. So yes, this would be the same thing as the square root of A over B, but if A doesn't divide by B, we can't leave it that way. All right, we have certain rules that we'll need to follow for simplest radical form. So if A is not divisible by B, we will do this little trick that's called rationalizing the denominator. We're going to change it so if we have a denominator, it at least have a rational number in it. So for example, if we have the square root of 5 divided by the square root of 2, 5 is not divisible by 2. This is the same thing as the square root of 5 halves, but we're not going to leave it that way. No fractions underneath the square root in the final answers. So we're going to rationalize the denominator. Right now, the denominator is the square root of 2, which is irrational. So we're going to change it. So basically what we can do is look at that denominator, square root of 2, and I'm going to multiply this fraction by the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. All right? So if you have anything n divided by n, a number divided by itself, that is always equal to 1. So I'm basically, square root of 2 divided by the square root of 2 is the number 1. Okay? And then we also have the property that if you take any number and you multiply it by 1, that's still the same amount. Okay, we'll get an equivalent form basically. So we're not really changing the amount, we're just changing the form of it. Okay, so when you multiply fractions, you multiply the numerators. So I'll write it out the long way. You're going to be doing the square root of 5 times the square root of 2. And you multiply the denominators. So the square root of 2 times itself. So the square root of 2 squared. Okay, so what we'll have is the square root of 10 divided by, remember we have a property for this. When you square a square root, you get the radicand, over 2. Now we have a rational number in the denominator. And that is how we're going to write it, okay? That's simplest radical form. All right, let's try another one. Let's say we have 3 divided by 5 times the square root of 7. All right, so in this one, we only have one radical, but it is in the denominator, so we need to get rid of that. So what we'll do is multiply the numerator and the denominator with the square root of 7 over the square root of 7. All right, so whatever radical you don't want in the denominator, that's what you'll use. Okay, so if you multiply the numerators together, 3 times the square root of 7, that is just 3 times the square root of 7. In the denominator, I have 5, and then I'm going to have the square root of 7 squared. Okay, so that's the whole point of using the square root of 7, is I'll have the square of it, and then that'll just turn into 7. So this is going to still have 3 times the square root of 7 in the numerator, and then I'll have 5 times 7 in the denominator, which is 35. So final answer, 3 times the square root of 7 divided by 35. Okay. All right, now let's look at, sometimes we have some common factors floating around, and so you have to do normal fraction simplifying. Okay, so first, we're dividing by the square root. It's irrational. So we're going to multiply this fraction with the square root of 6 divided by the square root of 6. And that is going to give me 8 times the square root of 6. This is the square root of 6 squared. So in my head, I know that'll be 6. Okay, now looking at this, this is not completely simplified. We definitely solved the square root problem, but now we have a normal fraction of 8/6. So we need to simplify that. 8 and 6 have a common factor of 2. So you can divide those each by 2. 8 divided by 2 would be 4. 6 divided by 2 would be 3. So we're going to have 4 root 6 divided by 3. That's the final answer. And we're in simplest radical form. Okay. The reason I could divide both of those by 2 is those were the regular numbers. All right. If I had 7 square root of 6 over 10, this one would not simplify. I couldn't divide the 6 and the 10 both by 2. This is the number 10, but this is not really the number 6. This is the square root of 6. So this particular one would not simplify.